Welcome and thank you for attending this year's first installment of Duchess Land Conservancy's Earth Matters webinar series. My name is Doug Olant and I am the Communications Manager with the Duchess Land Conservancy. Tonight we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Joan Maloof, founder of the Old Growth Forest Network. Before we get started, my role tonight is to go over the basic logistics about this webinar. After that, our Education Director, Julie Hart, will provide a brief introduction to the Duchess Land Conservancy and tonight's presenter. First, you are muted and chat is disabled for this event to ensure that there is no interruption during the presentation. Second, the raise hand function is disabled. Please enter all questions into the Q&A box at any point during the presentation. You can access the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen. Questions will be addressed when the presentation is done or by our team during the presentation if possible. If there are a great deal of questions, we will try to combine them based on topics. Third, closed captioning is enabled for this event. To turn this function on, please select the CC icon located on the bottom of your screen. And finally, I will hand it over to Julie Hart, our Education Director, who will tell you a bit about the Duchess Land Conservancy, this webinar series, and our guest presenter tonight.
Thank you, Doug. I'm Julie Hart, an ecologist and educator here at the Duchess Land Conservancy. And I want to say good evening to everyone. And thank you so much for joining us for the first webinar in our 4th season of Earth Matters. For those of you who have attended these webinars before, welcome back. And for those of you finding us for the first time, I hope that you will continue to join us throughout the season. Many of you are probably familiar with the DLC, but for anyone who's not, here's a quick overview. The Duchess Land Conservancy is a private nonprofit land conservation organization located in the Hudson Valley of New York State. And we're dedicated to preserving the farms and forests, wetlands and waterways, open spaces, and wildlife habitats of Dutchess County. We are an accredited land trust, and since our founding in 1985, we've worked with hundreds of landowners and protected over 47,000 acres of land. And we also want to thank our sponsors, the Molly B. Schaefer Education Fund, Labella Associates, and Mutual of America. So we're really excited about this new season of Earth Matters. It's going to happen on the first or sometimes the second Wednesday of each month through April. And we'll be bringing you a fascinating speaker with lots to teach us. And this season, we're going to be learning about the wonders of trees and forests and the important ecological roles that they play. I hope that these webinars will help you to see the trees and forests around you in a new way, to read the stories that can be found in their branches and buds, to see the connections between trees and the wildlife they support, and to find a new appreciation for these diverse and resilient communities called forests. So let's get started. Tonight, we're thrilled to welcome Dr. Joan Maloof, a professor emeritus of biological sciences and environmental studies at Salisbury University, and the author of numerous research articles and books. And with titles such as Nature's Temples, Treepedia, The Living Forest, Among the Ancients, Teaching the Trees, and Wild Old Woman, you can tell we found the perfect person to kick off this season. In addition to her research and writing, Dr. Maloof has founded the Old Growth Forest Network, an organization with the goal of creating a network of protected forests across the United States. Through this organization and her writing and teaching, Dr. Maloof works to educate us on the extent and condition of our forests and to encourage their protection. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Joan, to help us understand what makes old growth forests special and how to save them.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for inviting me here tonight. And I'm amazed there's almost 90 people on this webinar already. So I can tell that you have a very successful program and a great and involved group.
People love trees.
Yes, as I do. So let's talk about trees then. What makes old growth forests special and how to save them? And I thought I would start tonight by putting us in the proper time scale context. Here we go. So I'm starting way back at the start of the Earth, approximately 4 billion years ago. And for the first billion years, really, there was no life on the planet. And then the first life forms were just these single cells. They weren't even, they didn't even have the organelles that we're used to, and they were in the water. And all the life forms were in the water until right about this time. And this was finally, we evolved multicellular creatures, and there were lots of different life forms in the ocean, but nothing on the land. Finally, life came onto the land about, let me move my little screen here so I can see my side things better. There we go. And then the forest evolved soon after that. So the forest evolved around 350 million years ago, and that's that first green line there. And the first forest didn't have very many different types of species. They didn't have a lot of animals in them because this life on land had just evolved. And then there were major extinction episodes, as we know, and many species of trees that existed then became extinct, and other species evolved, and life goes on, and it's a continual change on this planet. And really, the flowering trees that we think of, like the maple trees and the tulip poplars and the oak trees, they didn't evolve until right around the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. So right about the time that the dinosaurs were going extinct, that's when these flowering plants, the angiosperms, really evolved. So they're more recent plant. And then look, way almost at the end of our timeline, this last wavy green line, that's 4 million years ago, and that's when humans evolved. So if anybody tells you that forests need humans, just think about this time scale. And forests have been around long before humans have been around. In fact, they've done better without us. Now let's shift to a much more recent time scale. And here we have the continents on the Earth as we know them. They weren't always like this, of course. There were times where there was one big supercontinent, and then they've split into 2 continents. And now we have this type of landmass. And a lot of it is covered with forests, these big plants that have evolved onto the Earth. And the global forest cover about 5,000 years ago was 46% of the land, but with human influence, that forest cover has been reduced to 31%. And we continue to lose forest cover every year from everything you can think of, from urbanization, desertification, conversion to agriculture. And this is measured by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Administration. Every 5 years, they come out with a new study telling us how much more forest cover we have lost. So on this diagram, if you think of all the green, doesn't matter the shade, that's 46%. That was 5,000 years ago. And now the light green has been lost and the dark green still exists. That's the 31% forest cover. This is another way to look at the same thing. So the green here would be what we consider primary forests, original forests, old growth forests, forests that have never been cut on the Earth. And then the yellow areas are the places where we have forests, but the forests have been cut and grown back, so they're considered second growth forests. Now, we cut these so recently that they haven't had time to yet recover and become like the original forests once were. Are we ever going to let that happen? We shall see. Time shall tell. Now zooming into a much more recent time scale and closer geography, what in 1620 wasn't even the United States yet, but we know it as that now. And the black areas are the areas that were covered with forest in 1620. And it is estimated that 50 to 60% of that black area would have been what we now consider a mature old growth forest. Yes, there were indigenous people there living there, and they were using the forests, and they were clearing some areas, and they were managing some areas, but the majority of the land was this natural forested landscape. And then come the European settlers, and they have their eyes on this landmass mainly because of its forests. And a lot of the places that these settlers had come from had already cleared their forests, and they needed forests for everything from shipbuilding to home building to railroad building. So a lot of our American forests were cut and exported. A lot of them were used right in the country, and then some of them were just cut and burned to make way for agriculture. But you notice on this that the forests out west were still fairly untouched then. That's because the western expansion hadn't really happened, but that is going to come next as the original forests decline further and further. And this is the estimates from 1920. And these graphs were actually made in 1925. So these were all drawn by hand with ink by the first head of the US Forest Service. And the cutting of the original old growth forest didn't stop in 1920. As you know, it continued. And some of you watching this today may have even known of an old growth forest that came down in your lifetimes. You know, this cutting has continued every decade. I know of some old growth forests that were cut during my lifetime. So the estimates now are that there is 1% left in the east and 5% left in the west. And why more in the West? Well, it was cut later. And also, I think because the conservation movement, by the time the cutting was seriously happening out West, it was starting to mature. And some people were speaking out and asking for preservation of some of those redwoods and sequoias. So that's the sad truth, and that's what we're gonna talk about, what's left today and what we can do to let more recover. So here's what it looks like specifically in New York. So this top left green point here in 1600, New York would have been about 95% covered in forest, and then the roller coaster dropped down with the European settlement, and finally the low point of the forest cover in right around the turn of the century in most places. Then after that, a lot of those cut areas were abandoned. People didn't want to pay taxes on this land. There was also a movement of people moving to the urban areas, and little by little, those cut and abandoned places started to recover, and forest cover did come back, maybe to as much as 50 to 60% of the landscape. New York in particular has a lot of forest cover. But we should keep in mind that these forests on the right-hand side of the scale, the recovered forests, are not the same as the forests on the left hand, the original forests, because those original forests were the old growth forests that had been an ecosystem intact for maybe thousands of years, you know, since the glaciers retreated. And there would have been many big trees and old trees in that ecosystem, whereas the newer forest doesn't have as many large trees or old trees. And as a result of losing all this forest, both globally and in New York, we're losing biodiversity because the forests are so important as habitat for terrestrial creatures. 80% of the world's terrestrial organisms depend on the forested ecosystem. And can you see my arrow, by the way, going down here? So this blue dotted line is the forest cover declining on the globe. And then the other line, the green and kind of orange line going up, is the carbon dioxide levels going up. Sorry, this is so depressing. We're going to get into some better things toward the end, but I just wanted to share the state of the way things were. And of course, the decline in forest cover is somewhat related to the increase in carbon dioxide, because forests do remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But although the forests are removing about 3 billion tons per year, we're adding 9 billion tons a year with fossil fuel combustion. So the trees can't really keep up. And then when we cut the trees down, not only can they not keep up, but that cutting actually releases more carbon into the atmosphere for a number of reasons. One is because when the trees are cut and timbered, a lot of the small branches and twigs and things are left to decompose. That releases carbon dioxide. And also because a large amount of carbon is stored in the soil in a forest. And when you log that forest, you're exposing that soil to the atmosphere, and a lot of that carbon gets oxidized and goes into the atmosphere. So a good part of the carbon being emitted from the forests, most of it is not from forest burning or forest rotting or insects. It's from the actual harvesting and logging. Okay, so deep breath. That's where we are. That's the bad news. So we have to start there, right? What can we do about that? What can we do to reverse or slow down what's being done and improve the planet for future generations? Because I look at those graphs of the old growth and I'm thinking, why didn't those people in the 1800s do more and save more of the forests, of the old growth? But it doesn't help to look back and blame them. We have to look at what we can do right now, what we can do so that our children can experience not only a healthy land now, but a more healthy land going forward. And their children can have older forests, and they're not just stuck at computers learning about the natural world that way. So when I asked myself this question, what I came up with, or what came to me, was this idea of an organization that would save any old growth forest left in the US, right? So that's that 1% in the East and 5% in the West. Certainly, we should not lose any more of that. None of that should be cut. But what about increasing that 1% and 5% to something a little bit more? And I'm not saying don't cut anything. I'm saying let's just leave more that can recover, that can become old growth in time. So I'm a scientist, so I like to do things that are measurable and sort of orderly and organized. So the vision then became, what if we could have one forest in each county of the US that's protected from logging and open to the public? And when I had that idea, I was out on the road researching forests for my book, Among the Ancients. And I had no clue how many counties were in the US. And I got home and Googled, and this is the picture that came up. And I went, oh boy, okay. So that's the goal. Any of these counties that can support forest growth is where we want to have a forest that won't be cut again. So the colors here are just the different forest types. So any color means that that county can support forest growth, meaning we need to find a forest there. The white ones are prairie or desert. So about 2/3 of the counties can support forest growth. So that's our goal of the old growth forest network. Protect the old growth and create this network to let people know where these protected forests are that are getting older. And this was started about 12 years ago, and it is a 501c3, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. So in each county, how we do this, we get someone who's interested in being a volunteer. We call them a county coordinator, and we might start them off with a list of forests that people have nominated or forests that we know about through the literature, such as Mary Bird Davis's survey in the East or Forest Service literature. We say, okay, here's anything nominated in your county. Sometimes there's nothing, and the volunteer just has to go out and ask around themselves. And what they're looking for is a forest as mature and native as possible. So if there is old growth forest in that county, that's the one that we want to put in the old growth forest network. Then we make sure that it's protected from logging. What that means is protected from commercial logging. Can't sell the trees, has to be open to the public and relatively accessible. So we're looking for places where grandparents can take their grandchildren. We're not looking for these little hidden away corners of wilderness that you might have to hike 10 miles to get into. We want forests that people can experience and see, because we want the next generation to be enthused by what they're seeing and feeling and to want to save forests in the future. Okay, so New York, 62 counties. So that's our mission, and all of these forests can support forest growth. So where do we start? We start with our volunteers, and we're lucky in New York because New York has some of the most, well, it has the most old growth forest in the East. And that's because of the Adirondack and Catskills parks and the Forever Wild promise that's in the state constitution that those parks will have a forest preserve that will stay forever wild, meaning it's not commercially logged and it's open to the public. 150,000 acres of old growth forest is the estimate of what's in the Adirondacks, although a lot of it is not very accessible. So even though there's a lot of old growth up there, to find things that are fairly easy to get to, it can be a challenge. And as New Yorkers, I also implore you to make sure that that forever wild stays in your state constitution. I know there have been some threats to it in the past. Also, New York, give yourselves a hand. You have passed one of the only old growth forest protection acts that I know of. And this was named after Bruce Kirschner, and he was someone that really cared about the old growth forests in New York and went around and monitored them and spoke out to preserve them. And this act in 2007 says that any state lands that are old growth are protected. So I encourage you, if you need to use that for any reason, go look that act up, or if you need it, I can send you a copy of it. Okay, so where are we in New York? The dark green counties are the counties that already have forests in the old growth forest network. And there is a list of them on the left. Now, this may be a little small and hard for you to read, but don't worry, I'll tell you where to find this on our website, and you can look at this at your leisure and find directions to all of these forests. And as I said, they're all open to the public and accessible, so you can enjoy them all. The sort of lighter color, we have nominations, and anybody can nominate a forest. So please don't hesitate. I'll give you my email address. Feel free to nominate a forest. And then in 2022, the light green counties were the ones that were in process. So it can take us a while to, once we identify the forest, and then we talk to the landowner, and it doesn't matter. Sometimes it's a state forest, sometimes it's a land trust owned forest, sometimes it's a city-owned forest, could even be a camp, or we do have one church, Nature Conservancy, Northeast Wilderness Trust. It doesn't matter who owns it, as long as it meets our criteria. So in 2024, here's where we are. You can see that we added those ones that were in process, and we are making progress. It's a slow and steady thing, and this is happening all across the nation, not just in New York. And we currently have, can't read all this. Oops, sorry. Forests in 39 different states. I think that says 267 forests. We add them. We now have a small staff of people. It started out, it was just me. Now we have some regional people. We have a wonderful woman, Sarah Rob Greco, who is the regional network manager for New England and New York. And we'll have people adding in the Midwest and the Southeast. So sometimes it's hard to keep track, but I think it's 267 in 39 states. So this is our website, oldgrowthforest.net. And if you click on the forest button, you can look by state and then by county, and you can see where all of those hundreds of forests are. And if you're planning a trip, maybe for Thanksgiving somewhere to visit family, you may want to look for one of our forests and go visit it there. And this, the donate button is here because we are exclusively supported by individuals who believe in our mission, and more by small family foundations. And it seems to have really struck a chord. People love the idea of the network, and they see it growing, and they've been very generous in supporting us. And we also educate about old growth forests, and we advocate for protection of old growth forests besides building the network. So under the resources tab, there is all of our educational resources, like the health benefits of forests for humans, and forests and carbon, and some of the things that I'm going to mention tonight. So once these forests get identified and the landowners are on board, the next thing we do is have a dedication and a hike through the forest. And these are really fun events, and they can be opportunities for press releases or big donors to attend, just celebrations. So here's a couple in New York. This is one in Suffolk County. And that one was really fun because there was a strong Native American presence there. They did a ceremony for us, and it was just a great time this time of year. And then your own Dutchess County has a forest in the Old Growth Forest Network, the South Woods of Bard College. And if you've never been and don't know where that is, I encourage you to go on our website and you'll find exact directions to that. So you might be asking yourself, Dutchess County already has a forest in the network. Is it possible to have more than one network forest per county? And the answer is yes. We have 4 counties in New York that all have 2 forests in the network. So if you think you have another excellent one, feel free to nominate it. And the Old Growth Forest Network also has other categories. We have one called Community Forest. And that is because we believe that not only should there be one of these old growth or future old growth forests in every county, but every community should have a forest, right? You might have a library, you have a school, might have a fire department. Shouldn't you have a forest? So we want to encourage that. So we have this category for the smaller, maybe closer to town forests, community forests. And then we didn't want to overlook those individuals who have made a commitment to not cutting their own private forests. And these people may not want to open their forests to the public, very understandable, but they want to let those trees get older and absorb the carbon and be habitat for the wildlife. So we recognize the commitment that they made and have a sign for them and can have a ceremony for them as well. So all along the way of building this network, I'm also writing about trees and old growth forests, teaching the trees. Among the ancients, I went to one old growth forest in each of the 26 eastern states. The Living Forest is a very large coffee table book I did with a Virginia photographer, Robert Llewellyn. Treepedia was Princeton University Press. Say if Living Forest is a big one, Treepedia is a tiny little one for, I say, the littlest room in the house. And then my newest forest book is Nature's Temples, A Natural History of Old Growth Forests. And the reason I wanted to write that book was because I kept hearing in the literature, and you read these things that the forest must be managed to be healthy. I said, really? It seemed like nobody was questioning that statement. And what does it really mean to be a healthy forest? So back to my science roots, right? I decided that I would delve into the research of anyone who had studied and compared old growth forests with younger managed forests. So who knows, right? Maybe the managed forests were healthier in some way or than the old growth. I was going to actually look at the scientific research. And as I was doing this, it's funny to be working on a book when it's never going to be a bestseller because it's just going to be for that narrow band of people like us that really care about the forests and don't have the time to research all the literature themselves. I thought, I will do it for you. And, with my academic access to the literature in the libraries, I was able to find and read these papers and compare the unmanaged old growth to the unmanaged old growth to the managed younger growth forests. And what I found, it takes up all those pages in the book, but I'm just going to summarize a little bit of it very quickly. One example, salamanders, right? Salamanders, more species of salamanders in the old unlogged forest, more types of salamanders. One paper, for example, where they studied redback salamanders, found in the old growth, there were 488 per acre. In the second growth, only 96 per acre. And in the clear cut, 0, because they can't live where it's dry. And even in wildflowers, the woodland wildflowers, there was more plant diversity in the unlogged old growth forest. And in many cases, they found that after a forest was logged, that plant diversity didn't recover. And this might not seem, at first you might seem like, oh, well, when you cut, you let the sunlight in and then you're going to have more wildflowers. But in a forest ecosystem, there are going to be gaps where old trees have fallen down and allow light to come in. And that's where these wildflowers grow. And there are pollinators in there, and there are ants for dispersal. So we have all the other organisms with the flowers. More moss species, more lichen species in the old growth forests. Some are only found on old trees. And then there are the small little things you wouldn't even think about, you know, the certain ground beetles, many more species of ground beetles, some types only found in the old growth. This tiny little snail, about the size of a grain of rice, only found in the old growth forest. That means if that forest is cut, you're probably exterminating that species of snail from the area. And, you know, this is research done by a master's degree student who just said, you know what, nobody's ever studied the snails in these old forests. I think I'm going to do it. And he compared these different forests. Another researcher studied the calicoid lichens. These are things that, as a PhD ecologist, I'd never even heard of these things before. These are tiny, close to microscopic little organisms. And they're found in little crevices and places all over trees and in the forests. And you really just have to collect different things and bring them back into the laboratory and study them under the microscope. And what this researcher found was in the old growth forest, you'll have over 20 different species. In the second growth, between 3 and 19 species, and in the young forest, only 0 to 2 species. So the older these forests get, the more biodiverse they're getting. More mushroom species in the older forests, if you love mushrooms. And a lot of them, yes, are connected with the tree roots, the mycorrhizal fungi. But a lot of them also connected with the decomposing wood, because there's a lot of decomposing wood in the older forests. And the older, the more established a forest gets, the more complex that mycorrhizal network gets in the forest. So this diagram with all the circles, this is a paper from Suzanne Simard's lab, and this is in a Douglas fir forest in the Pacific Northwest. And the older, larger trees are the dark green circles, and those trees are connected to more of the other trees than the young ones. So one of these old trees might be connected to 47 other trees in that plot, whereas the young ones may only be connected to maybe a dozen. So this older forest has this really established mycorrhizal network, and that mycorrhizal network is holding a lot of that carbon. The trees have taken the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, moved it down into their roots. The fungi are able to get some of those sugars from the trees for their energy, and they spread it throughout the soil. And then other soil organisms are feeding on that mycorrhizal network too. So that's how all that carbon gets down into the soil. And then there's the question of forest management. So this reddish color line with the arrow, that's the carbon contained in the forest, the above ground carbon in a forest that's not logged. So over the years, that carbon will increase as those trees grow. And those other various colored dotted lines and dashed lines there are different types of forest management. You know, whether you're talking about selective cutting or shelter belt cutting or regeneration cutting, that sort of thing. They're all going to lose carbon as part of that cutting compared to an uncut forest. So the unmanaged northern hardwood forests sequester more carbon than any of the active management. So in summary from that book, then, in the older unmanaged forests, higher carbon storage, more salamanders, more lichens, more beetles, more fungi, more snails, and more herbaceous plants. So and I would also say, and the oldest trees are in the old growth, of course, and then the largest trees are in the old growth places. So which would you say is healthier? the managed or the unmanaged forest. But it can be challenging because the forest industry comes out with these statements that sound so convincing. So if you hear something like this quote, "Our purpose is to enhance forest health, leading to forest resiliency with a long-term sustainable project, primarily through science-based best practice forest thinning and treatments." That might sound good to you. I mean, using all those buzzwords there. And they really are buzzwords. A lot of times it's public relations agencies that are telling these folks which words sound better to the general public. And those are the words they'll use, like health, restoration, regeneration, sustainability, and resiliency. All of those sound good, but then the end result looks like this on the ground. So I would just encourage you to question those terms, to look at the science behind what they're saying and always ask for the science. Really, resiliency? This happened to me just a few weeks ago. I went to this hearing. I'm trying to save an older forest here, and the person from the Forest Service was claiming that the reason that they were cutting these giant old pine trees was for climate resiliency. So, you know, you just have to ask, okay, where's the science that shows that this will indeed create climate resiliency? Another one of these kind of buzz terms that you'll hear is that these days it's very popular. Oh, we need more early successional habitat. And that's why we're clearing that. There's a lot of wildlife that needs these clearings. So we're doing the right thing. We're helping the wildlife. Really pay attention to that, because that sounds good, right? Helping the wildlife. But why are you cutting down mature trees to create this early successional habitat? Isn't there early successional habitat under all our high power lines? Or if you really want early successional habitat, why don't you let some of these agricultural fields recover, or places with lawns like schools, or some golf courses are being abandoned these days, and let that be your early successional habitat. And the reason that they're going after the forest to create early successional habitat, they won't tell you, but it's because they're going to get the money from the trees. And so they want to cut those trees, they want to get the money, and they'll couch it as young forest initiative, that young forests are really good. I got so frustrated by this that I actually wrote a whole scientific paper with these other co-authors about this, and the paper is available under resources on our web page. So please take a look at that if you come across one of those projects. So to kind of wrap up then, what can a land trust do to reverse this, to have more older forests, more biodiversity, sequester more carbon? So number one is save the oldest forests, right? So where are the oldest forests in your community? If they're on private land, maybe you want to get to know that private landowner. Maybe you, instead of waiting for those forests coming to you, maybe be proactive and try to identify those oldest forests and get to know the owners, or even the, you know, if it's public land, make sure that it's under a special protection. And you may be doing all these things already, I don't know, but I just wanted to remind you. The next bullet point has to do with conservation easements. Land trusts are wonderful for putting conservation easements. They're so important. I encourage you, wherever you can, put either a forever wild or a no log conservation easement on a property. If you have private landowners, give them the option. Explain to them that if they don't put a no log easement on there, that if they sell their property, the next owner could just have that forest cut down. Not all land trusts do offer no log easements. I know my local land trust, unfortunately, they're not crazy about them, but I hope that'll change and more owners will at least be given the option. Then in New York, advocate for New York State forest land preservation. That's the Forever Wild. Next, advocate for changes to the 480 current use tax laws. So those who own forest land in New York can get a lower tax rate if they sign up for this program, 480A, but 480A also tells you that you have to manage your forest, which means you have to hire a forester to review it. And if that forester says it needs to be cut, that you have to be cut, that you have to cut to stay in that program or pay a very serious financial penalty. I believe that the lower tax rates should also be for those who don't want to cut their forests, because they're giving a lot of community benefit by cleaning the air, by cleaning the water, by having recreational space, by having biodiversity habitat. They should get the same tax breaks as people who cut their forest. And there are some in state government that are looking into this, so stand behind them. Next, get as many people as possible out into the older forests. So plan hikes, have people fall in love with these older forests so that they will want to save even more. They will want to donate to your land trust so you can preserve even more land. And finally, don't be fooled by those health claims of the forest industry. So it's a big job, right? We have to work together to retain the forest, the older forests, and build a community of people who care about them and work together. Encourage you to get on our mailing list. If you get on the mailing list, if we have another dedication in New York, we'll invite you. You'll get to go on the hike. We'll have fun. We'll meet each other. If you have any questions, you can ask me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. That was wonderful. We're going to be sending a follow-up email to everyone, and that email is going to include links to Joan's website and the Old Growth Forest Network website, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar. So please keep adding your questions into the Q&A. But before we launch into that, I want to invite you to our next webinar, which is on Wednesday, December 4th at 6 o'clock Eastern Time. Our speaker is going to be Doug Tallamy, who is the author of many, many wonderful books. He's an entomologist. And he's going to be discussing his book, The Nature of Oaks, the Rich Ecology of Our Most Essential Native Trees. So we hope that we will see you there for that. And are we ready to dive into the Q&A? All right, so first there's a question pointing out that a lot of old growth forests are inaccessible, as you mentioned, and also suggesting that's probably why they're still there. So asking the question, does opening them to the public jeopardize those areas?
This is a question that's been asked before, but my attitude is these old growth forests are what the earth produces naturally, so this is what Mother Earth wants to make, these beautiful old forests. And if we spend our lives in either a human-made habitat, like the building I'm sitting in, or in these depauperate second growth forests, we're never going to understand what our earth is, what it can do. So I believe that it's really important for us to be able to experience that. And I think that might be part of helping us to actually save it by having that experience. So I think a little bit more footsteps, maybe if an invasive seed or two coming in is worth it if it's going to increase those of us who are going to really stand up for the forest in a big way. So I have no problem opening, or most of these forests already have trails through them anyway, the ones that we put in the network, and people are already visiting. And I think to myself, who's going to visit? Usually people that love trees and love forests are going to respect it. These aren't people bringing, coolers and having parties.
Okay, thank you, Joan. Our next question is, has anyone done research on what types of trees are most common in old growth forests in different areas?
Yeah, every part of the, well, I mostly work in the US, so every part of the US, I mean, trees are more common there just because of the climate and the soil type. So there will be places where redwood trees are the most common, and that's where the old growth there is going to be redwood. Another place will be sequoia, another place it'll be Doug fir or bristlecone pines, or there's all kinds of different on the east. Some of our old growth is oak, some is hemlock. There's not one particular type of tree. Even, pines in the east. It really just depends on what was growing there because of the soil and the climate, and then what happened not to be cut.
It's interesting because I'm thinking about some of the experiences I've had wandering around all sorts of forests in Dutchess County. And when I run across a really, really enormous tree that is clearly hundreds of years old, it's almost always a white oak. And white oak is not uncommon around here, but red oak is much more common than white oak. So that's always kind of struck me as an interesting shift in forest composition, and wondering, some trees were left as boundary trees or sentinel trees. You'll see them on the old surveys. So it's so interesting, the regional differences that you see.
Yeah, and when I see something like that, like all of a sudden there's this big white oak, I will look at its growth form. And if it does have lower branches and it's a lot larger than the trees around it, I think, yes, maybe that was a tree that was left in a pasture.
Yeah.
And the white oak acorns were a popular food for the pigs, especially that were put out to pasture there. So, maybe they had some use to some when they were left there. And now the forest has grown up around them.
Yeah, you can imagine the stories that tree wants to tell you.
Hundreds of years.
Now, the next question is about the carbon sequestration programs, asking, aren't these programs helping forests to survive by paying landowners to save the trees?
Yes, so the the carbon sequestration programs are kind of controversial. Some people think, oh, you're just, giving some people money, but they're still polluting elsewhere. But I am in favor of them. And it is because, as I said, if you're a private owner and you're wanting to protect your forests, shouldn't you get something for that? The people that cut down their forests get something for it. What about the people that let them stand? So, yes, let's give these people some money for the carbon that's being sequestered out of the atmosphere. And I do think it's helping in some cases, but sometimes it has a little catch to it, because if you put a no-log easement on your forest, you can't get into one of these carbon programs because they like to say, oh, this is a forest that was going to be cut. So then we're just expanding the rotation out another 20 years and then it can still be cut. I think instead that some of that money should be going to the people that put the no-log easement on it. So I'm in favor of them, but they're not perfect yet.
Okay. Our next question is much, much broader. What is your definition of old growth?
Yes, well, that is broad because no one has a particular answer to it. I like to say just a forest that's developed naturally over a long period of time with very little disturbance from humans, or you could even say from nature. You know, a forest that got lucky. It didn't burn down, it didn't blow down, it didn't get cut down. It's been in process for a long, long time, and long enough that it has a cycle of life and death. Trees have been able to grow from seedlings, die of old age, fall and rot, and new seedlings come up. So you see, that's a long definition. But even Biden was coming out with an executive order in 2022, and he wanted his Forest Service to define old growth and tell how much of it was left on the federal lands. And so you see, they didn't even have a definition. And what they ended up doing was using definitions for different forest types. So there would be one definition for the Douglas fir forest and another definition for an oak hickory forest, let's say. But if you just think of a natural forest that's never been cut down, that's basically what it is.
Thank you. The next question is about fragmentation, and they're asking, by taking the county by county approach, is there a risk of creating a future ecosystem of fragmented forests rather than focusing on larger plots of whole forests?
So when I first thought of the old growth forest network and that we needed to increase the amount of old growth forest, future old growth forest, at first I was thinking of all these wildlands, you know, and then the wildlands to me felt so far away and so remote. And I thought, is the average child ever going to get to see one of those places? You know, who's going to take them there? How will they even get in there? And that's why I decided to go smaller and more local by doing it at the county level, because every school district then in forest place of the world will have one of these uncut forests, future uncut forests close to them. And I don't think by focusing on the county that there's any threat to fragmentation. Fragmentation's going on like mad all the time, everywhere anyway. And if anything, by identifying a forest and celebrating its intactness, we're helping to slow the fragmentation. I'm curious, does the Dutchess Land Trust, County Land Trust, Land Conservancy have any old growth forests?
Not that we know of.
Mhm.
As far as I know, the only old growth forest in Dutchess County is the one at Montgomery Place, that bar that you
Okay.
mentioned.
Okay.
We run across occasional very, very old trees that have clearly been there
Mhm.
for a while, probably were growing in fields originally, as you said.
Mhm.
Um, that's the only one that I've heard of.
Okay.
There may be
I
other
was curious.
places. There are some
Mhm.
places that are just unaccessible, you know, deep ravines. There's quite a lot of largish trees along the Hudson River, in the bluff areas that were just too steep for anybody to
Yeah.
get in. But yeah, it's few and far between. It's
And
really
it's
special when
amazing
you
when you
find it.
think of that whole county was at one time,
Yeah,
the majority of it was old growth. Yeah.
I think about that a lot when I'm in the woods out in
Yeah.
Dutchess County, what the forests are like now, and try to imagine what they might have been like
Mhm.
500 years ago. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah.
And now looking to the future, the next question is asking, can you comment on Governor Hochul's proposal to restore New York State forests by planting many millions of trees by 2030? Is that a positive direction for New York?
I'm like, I I know a lot of people enjoy planting trees because it feels like you're doing something really good, and trees are wonderful, of course, and trees will make any natural habitat better by their shade and cleaning the air and water. But in my opinion, we should not be focusing on planting trees until we stop removing the trees that we already have. It just kills me to see a beautiful older forest be cut down by the same government that's over here, giving people grants to plant trees along the highways or something. That's never going to be equivalent to the ecological health in a forest. So I would rather see that time, energy, and money be spent to preserve the native forests that are already growing. And once we do that, then yes, let's plant more.
Thanks, Joan. Our next question is from a viewer who writes that she's been on nature walks in a part of Allegheny State Park in which there is a section of old growth forest. It did not show up in your county list. Is it too small?
So this Allegheny State Park, is this in New York?
Yes, it's in
Um,
the southern tier out in the western part of the state.
so I would say, no, it's not because it's too small. It's either no one's nominated it, so we don't know about it. So that's a possibility. So I would say definitely send an email in and nominate it. Or it could be it's already nominated and we're just getting to it. We're communicating with the state parks people. We're trying to figure out when we can do this. So these things do take a while, and we do have a backlog, which is a good thing. So yes, send in an email, nominate it. Love to come up there and see it.
Thank you. That sounds like an exciting new possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's a question. In order to maintain an old growth forest that's open to the public, how do you recommend treating the safety aspect of dead trees and how they're removed from the forest? What about those in wildfire prone areas? Should those logs be removed?
Okay, a couple questions there. So in an old growth forest, you are going to have a lot of dead trees on the forest floor. We call the ecologists, we call that coarse woody debris. And that is a fabulous, wonderful thing. It's one of the indicators of an old growth forest because it means that these trees have gotten big and old and died of old age. And now they're going to be habitat for a lot of other living things. So a lot of the things I was talking about, like the lichens and the fungi and the salamanders and the beetles, they're all living in and on that dead wood, and that dead wood is decomposing. It's like a sponge. It's staying very moist and it's releasing its nutrients into the soil for the living trees. So whenever possible, you do not want to remove those dead trees. You don't want to do any kind of salvage logging, even if there's a tornado or something. You want to just leave those trees there because it's going to keep that carbon and nutrients in that forest, and it'll make the next forest spring up and be that much healthier there. So now that's a different question from, I don't know whether the person was asking, if you let the public in there, how do you keep a tree from falling down on them? I don't know. I guess people need to just not go in the forest in the middle of a windstorm, and if it is truly a hazard tree near a trail, we're okay with that being removed. We just say no commercial logging, but hazard trees can be removed along a trail. And as far as the fire question, the dead, actually, living trees burn faster than dead trees. It's very unintuitive, but the fallen trees should not be removed as a forest as a fire hazard, or even the dead trees. And the older a forest is, actually, the more naturally resistant it is to fire because of the thicker bark and because of the moisture in that ecosystem, including in the dead wood there. And there are lots of studies on both sides of this, and there's no clear cut by a wide margin that the older forests are more fire resistant. They can burn, but it's looking like the science that I'm reading and studying, that the actual older a forest is, the more wild it is, the more protected it is from the fires.
Great, thank you, Joan. Our next question is, has anyone mapped where these different ancient trees are?
And the answer is no. It was pretty interesting. So when the Biden executive order came out and he said he wanted to know, where these old growth were on the federal land. I mean, you would think we should have known in our national forests where the old growth was, but we didn't. And so actually the federal government then called up the Old Growth Forest Network and said, we would like your data layer of where the old growth forests are. And we said, we don't have any such thing. And so that didn't exist. But it was very interesting then in the last 2 years, two different groups of people, both this governmental team using LIDAR, working with NASA, a program called JEDI, GEDI. They've been able to measure with satellite above ground carbon. So that's a good kind of indicator for big old trees on the ground. And another group out in Oregon also used LIDAR data and put together where they think kind of generally the most carbon dense forests are. So it's kind of an indicator of older forests, but it's not specific by address, and it's certainly not specific by tree. So the answer to this person is no, we're just now getting started with being able to map old growth. And it's pretty amazing that we hadn't so far.
Mm-hmm. And it's a challenging task to even think about doing. Now, the next question is just a quick confirmation of something we've talked about already. Are there any other old growth forests in Dutchess County that you know of besides the one up at Bard?
I would have to look at our nominations list.
Okay.
But nothing comes to mind. Yeah. One of yours will be a future old growth forest. Have any with no log easements on them, or?
There are definitely a lot of protected forests around here. Not necessarily with no log easements, but certainly that are not anticipated to be logged at any time. So
that's not good enough.
Check back in 100 years or so.
Now I'm going to check back in 5 years. Make sure you have a no log easement.
Okay, Joan.
Okay. I think that's a great spot. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for what you're doing, the Land Conservancy. When I read how many thousands of acres you had, it's just so exciting. And you obviously have a really, vital group. So many people tapping in, so many people donating to the organization. You've really got something wonderful going on. So thank you for letting me be a small part of it tonight.
Thank you. We do have a few other questions in the Q&A if we'd like to keep going. Would that be okay?
I think this is a good place to stop.
Okay.
But anyone's free to email me if they had specific questions that they wanted me to really ask. So Joan@oldgrowthforest.net.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Joan. This has been wonderful. I'm going to send the email that will point people towards your website where they can find more information and check out those maps and hopefully nominate some forests in their own backyards to be part of your network.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Julie.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Joan.